the magistrate's primary assignment is the execution of God's wrath on evildoers with the sword of justice. The magistrate's assignment is the executing of God's wrath on evildoers with the sword of justice. If you look just a couple verses down from where we ended our reading, verses 4 says that the magistrate is the minister of God as a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. And that is why he bears not the sword in vain. That's Romans 13:4. They're given a sword to execute God's wrath on evildoers. It's a ministry of violence, which is why Christians must always think in terms of limited government. Christians should always think in terms of limited government. Why? Because the civil government has a ministry of violence. Okay? Follow this? Whatever the civil government gets involved in ultimately has a threat of violence behind it. That's why we want it limited. That's why we want it chained to constitutions. That's why we want it chained to checks and balances. The Bible also teaches that this justice is to be blind and impartial. That's Deuteronomy 1:17. And it's to be based on due process, 2 or 3 witnesses, and strict retribution without pity. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That's in Deuteronomy 19:21. And all the old paintings and statues of Lady Justice, she's pictured as a woman who either has a blindfold on or her eyes are blind, they're empty. So if you can look up later on today, go look up an old statue or a painting of Lady Justice. She'll either be blindfolded or her eyes will be empty. She's blind. And she holds in her right hand a sword. There's the sword of justice, like Romans 13 says. And in her left hand, she holds a set of scales. This is her job. Her job is she's not to judge based on the face of man. She's not to judge on how rich or how poor, male or female, tall or short, black, white, all of this, that's irrelevant. She is blind, and she has a set of scales. And her job is to do as best as she can to establish and hold that balance. And so when there's been theft, the civil magistrate's job is to assign restitution to bring it back into balance. Pay it back and pay for the damages. Has a life been taken? Well, then ordinarily that would mean that a life needs to be taken. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That balance needs to be restored, and Lady Justice is given her sword to require it, to coerce it. Incidentally, and this is where I get back to why I said that it always tends to violence, this is why you don't want the civil government running health care or education. This is why you don't want, you can just make a caricature of it. Do you want a blindfolded lady with a sword doing your health care? Some of you are like, maybe. No, you don't. No, you don't. No, you don't want the blindfolded lady doing surgery on grandma. No, you don't want the blindfolded lady running your schools. It's not an accident, I don't think, at all. In nations that have embraced socialized medicine, right? In nations where we've decided, let the government run healthcare, you give it 15 minutes, and the very next thing that's going to be brought up is euthanasia. That is not an accident. Now, why does that happen? Well, men are wicked. Yes, I know. There's just evil and there's wickedness. But part of it is also, again, God designed the magistrate to do violence. That's actually its job. And so I think there's this gravity built into it. It's like, that's what God designed the government to do. And so when you give that job, take care of grandma, to the government, not only is it going to go badly in all kinds of ways, but you're asking for it to become violent. And I don't think it's an accident at all that when you let the government run the schools, you end up with school shootings. No, it's not an accident. This violent ministry establishes the biblical legitimacy of the death penalty, especially for murder. This goes all the way back to Genesis 9, after the flood. God said life for life. And that's the basic standard, basic principle of justice. Now, some of you might be wondering, okay, I hear that eye for eye, tooth for tooth thing, but Jesus said something about that, right? And in the Sermon on the Mount, what is Jesus talking about? Well, what Jesus is talking about in the Sermon on the Mount is he's actually upholding the principles that Paul is teaching us here in Romans 13. What Jesus is saying is you personally are not authorized to carry out civil justice. You personally, or even in the government of your family, are not authorized to carry out vengeance. Eye for eye justice is carried out by the civil magistrate, not you. That's what he's talking about. We can actually see this same principle of personal prohibition against animosity and vengeance and the upholding of vengeance by the civil magistrate. We actually see it in our text in Romans 12 and Romans 13. So if you actually read at the end of Romans 12 is actually talking about personal interactions. And at the end there it says, verse 19, Romans 12:19, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves. Christians, you're not allowed to get vengeance yourself. No vengeance personally, but rather give place to wrath. Leave room for wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he thirsts, give him drink, and in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Personally, and this is the same thing that Jesus is requiring in the Sermon on the Mount, you must not have personal animosity or vengeance or grudges against even your enemies. But he says, leave room for wrath. Vengeance is the Lord's. How do you do that? Keep reading, Romans 13. All authority, all power is established by God. And then in verse 4 of Romans 13, it says, now the magistrate is the minister of God. But if thou do what is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Leave vengeance to the Lord. Call the cops. That's what it says. How does God ordinarily bring vengeance on evildoers? The magistrate. He's the minister of God's vengeance. Now, of course, some things don't get punished in this life, and some things do await the final judgment. But ordinarily speaking, that's the assignment that God has given them. So if your enemy's broken into your shop and is trying to make off with a bunch of your tools, and you catch him, and you make him sit down and put his hands behind his back and everything else, if he's thirsty, you can give him something to drink and call the cops. Right? No personal animosity. That might not be that neat and tidy, I know, in the real life. But that's the principle. The principle is no personal animosity, respect his humanity, treat him as a human being, and call the cops. The magistrate's job is to bring God's wrath down upon him.